Hello and greetings, everyone. My name is Harun, and I'd like to welcome you to our podcast series as part of the Legacies of Learning Project at the Islam UK Centre at Cardiff University. This project is generously supported by the Jameel Educational Foundation, and we're delighted that you have tuned in to our series. Education, pedagogy, and learning have been subjects of detailed discussions by Muslim authors from the early Islamic period to this day. Our Legacies of Learning project draws on a range of historical sources in the Islamic tradition in order to investigate notions of learning and knowledge production in the medieval and early modern Islamic world. In this series, we talk with leading scholars who are exploring the Islamic intellectual tradition and who can help us explore the potential educational implications and applications of this tradition in the contemporary period. I'm really honored for our to have our guest here today, Adam Bursi, and we've also got my colleague Iyad Abu Ali who's joined us. So we've got our first sort of book chat where we have three people as opposed to two people. So it's a nice little experiment that we're having this afternoon. Just to introduce our guest today. So Adam Bursi, who's kindly joined us this afternoon. Has written a wonderful book, and I strongly recommend that people get a copy of this book if they're able to do so. This book is a contribution to the scholarship of studying Islam alongside other antique religions, and it's called Traces of the Prophets. And in this book, our author highlights how early Muslims deployed sacred objects and spaces to inscribe and dispute Islam's continuities with and differences from Judaism and Christianity. The book argued that prophets' relics ritually and rhetorically shaped Muslim identities in the first centuries of Islam. Traces of the Prophets rewrites the history of holy bodies and sacred spaces in the emergence of Islam. Rather than focusing on theological controversies among early Muslims, this book is grounded in the material objects and places that Muslims touched and fought with in defining Islamic practice and belief. While often marginalized in modern scholarship, sacred relics and spaces stood at the disputed boundaries of emergent Islamic identities. Objects and spaces like Abraham's footprints in Mecca and Muhammad's tomb in Medina provided sites of shared Islamic ritual as well as tools of differentiating Muslims from non Muslims. So, first and foremost, thank you very much, Adam, for joining us this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you, Harun and Iyad for having me. And it's a real honor to be invited.
Wonderful. And Iyad, I think you should dive straight in with some of your observations and reflections, and we can take the conversation from there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Adam, for taking part in this series of book talks. I just want to reiterate that congratulations on such a well-written book that really touches on some of the most interesting topical and you know um, important methodological um, uh, sort of developments in Islamic studies and in study of history more broadly. I guess I have many questions and comments about the book, which I really enjoyed reading. It's, as I said, it's a very well written piece of work, and yeah, I guess maybe we could just start by asking, just to open it with, tell us how you sort of came about to write the book, like what sort of questions were motivating you at the beginning, or and sort of, yeah, maybe a little bit about the where it sits in its field of scholarship. Yeah.
Sure. So it's like many first academic monographs. It's a heavily revised version of my dissertation that I completed at Cornell University, Cornell University in the U.S. In 2015, and that dissertation was looking at the ways that bodies, both whole bodies and pieces of bodies, were used by Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the late antique period, both rhetorically and ritually, in distinguishing between licit religion and illicit magic or sectarian practice. So the dissertation had to do with relics for sure, but also sort of practices, and because relic practices are sometimes marginalized as magic or non-licit religion, relics were something that came up a lot in the dissertation. And what was interesting to me was a lot of scholarship on late antiquity, late antique Judaism and Christianity will often use early Islam as sort of a foil to the relic practices that you find among late antique Christians. The idea being that late antique Christians were doing all sorts of things with relics, visiting shrines and using relics in both public and private religion. And the idea being that Muslims were these like extremely iconoclastic monotheists that saw all of these practices as shirk or idolatry or paganism. And this is something that we see, like Peter Brown was using Islam's rejection of these practices as a distinct difference from late antique Christianity. And what I was finding when I started to look at both Hadith and historical sources was that actually we find plenty of references to Muslims actually doing things with sacred spaces and sacred objects, things like the Prophet's hair, the Prophet's sandals, the Maqam Ibrahim, which is not always thought of as a relic, but you can think of as a form of a relic of the Prophet Abraham. And sort of suggesting that the ways that early Muslims were using relics, both physical relics, but also the idea of relics, was a way of both forming Muslim identities in terms of an internal community, but also the ways that they were using ideas about relics to distinguish Muslims from non-Muslims. So obviously there's a lot of hadith in which there is a rejection of building mosques on the tombs of prophets and these kinds of things. So there clearly was a rhetoric from quite early in Islamic history rejecting some of the things that we think of as relic practices, and categorizing these as the kinds of things that Jews and Christians do but Muslims don't. So there's both evidence of relic practices and the rejection of relic practices very early in Islamic history. And so the ways that these objects and places and the discourses that surround them were formative for the distinguishing of Muslims from non-Muslims, certain Muslim communities from other Muslim communities, and the ways that these are important things that people fought with in defining communities in this period.
Thank you. So, yeah, just to pick up on a few points that you mentioned. So I liked how in the book you sort of translate traces as athar in a way to sort of not sort of make it sort of equivalent to relics as we might think of relics in the contemporary sense of what a relic is. And I was wondering, perhaps you might want to tell us a bit more about how you see the word athar functioning, I guess, in the sources that you're discussing. Also, I mean, connected to that, I guess, is
Sure.
a question of epistemology, in the sense that as you say, this sort of these distinctions between magic, science, religion, which we might have as contemporary scholars, as modern scholars. Um, uh, how do you see? How do you sort of get around these like sort of um, the use of traces or the use of athar, and do you see a way to like move around these sorts of difficult epistemic questions in a way?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, athar is a really interesting word because it can both mean something completely immaterial. So it's used in some texts as sort of a synonym for hadith, as both a reported tradition, it also it's also sometimes used to distinguish sort of a non prophetic tradition from a hadith proper, which is something transmitted from the Prophet Muhammad. But it's often used, just as a word to talk about a transmitted report. So there's that meaning of the word, and then there's also the ways in which it's used for places that are associated with the previous presence of a prophet having been there, or a physical object like the prophet's hair is sometimes called athar. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's an interesting word because it's also used by Arabic in Arabic Christian texts for relics, physical relics of holy persons, like saints and Jesus and Mary. So it clearly does have some sense of being, something like what we translate as relic. But as kind of as with the word, I'll start over that. The word athar also like has this just a trace of something that's not there anymore. And which is interesting because that's also that sort of play, or that sort of ambiguity of the word is also present in the word relic itself. Although we think of relic as something that is a physical thing left behind, but it's also the word itself in Latin has this kind of connotation of something that's not there anymore. And these kinds of words are there in the other like Greek and Syriac and other languages that Christian communities were using. So yeah, the question of so for example, the footprints of Abraham are called athar, and the word athar can also, of course, just mean sort of footprints, traces in that sense, right? And so yeah, there is this sort of ambiguity between presence and absence, which was something that was interesting to look at. Was there's sometimes this theme or theory in scholarship that is found in some texts that while Muslims focused on these objects like the Maqam Ibrahim, which indicate the absence of prophets, that in fact, like the presence of this object is itself part of what makes it holy. I would argue that it's not just like the demarcation of the absent prophet, but the object itself is present in the world and indicates the previous presence. But the word athar is also used in regards to these other sort of places, like there's this vocabulary of ittiba al-athar, following the traces, or athar at-nabi, so following the traces of the prophet. And this has both positive and negative connotations depending on the context. That there's stories about Bukhari, the famous Hadith collector and scholar, that he in a dream was seen to be following the athar of the prophet, indicating perhaps that he was just following in the footsteps of the prophet. But then there's also this sort of in hadith sources often sort of negatively connotated meaning of following the traces of the prophet, in terms of like going around to places where the prophet had physically been. And there's sort of like a not always very positive, that like this is perhaps like too closely trying to or that following the prophet, going to these physical places might be seen as like making the prophet into too holy of a person, or following his model too closely. The Caliph Umar's son, Abdullah ibn Umar, is said in particular to have someone to have followed the prophet's traces very closely. And the sort of question of whether this is positively or negatively connotated is really up in the air, I think, in the sources. He's said to be the only person among the companions that did this, was to particularly follow the prophet's traces in terms of physically going to all these places where the prophet had been in Mecca and Medina. And the question of whether this was because he was so righteous and pious that he did this, or because he was making a mistake in doing this, is a little bit. It depends on how you read the sources, I would argue. So yeah, I mean, in terms of like the meaning of this word, yeah, I think there's this play between the idea of presence and absence, and physicality and non-physicality. That, yeah, this is why I didn't, I chose to title the book "Traces of the Prophets," because I felt like relics was maybe too physical of a word. That playing with the sort of like the presence and absence in these texts was part of what made them interesting in some ways. Yeah.
Yeah, for definitely like got the sense of the presence and absence being important in the word athar. But just to pick up on also some of the things you mentioned, like um, when you mentioned that athar can also be sort of a narration or a hadith, and then you mentioned Ibn Umar, I think that's something that really stood out to me while I was reading the book. So, for example, when I was reading what you were writing about Ibn Umar and Bukhari, following the Prophet's traces, literal sort of um, traces, literal footprints in a way. It seemed to me an interesting question for. I mean, I'm not a hadith scholar, but for the transmission of hadith, it seemed almost like a legitimating um, factor in the transmission of hadith. The fact that these people have gone through the same spaces and the same places, almost like retracing his steps in a way and collecting narrations. I guess for the transmission of knowledge, I guess, which is what this sort of series is more about. Like that'd be an interesting. I thought that was an interesting thing to think about. And yeah, what do you think about that? Like, what does this? I mean, I don't know if I'm correct in assuming that this grants some sort of legitimation to the traditions that they come up with, or part of the sort of biography that one is expected to sort of have if they collect hadith, narrate hadith, and relay what the Prophet was actually doing.
Yeah, I think that that's right, and they're legitimating devices. These stories about people like Ibn Umar going to these places and praying there, or just physically being there. I think are legitimating devices also for these places as ways of narratively, textually indicating that these really are places that the prophet has been and prayed at, or just were physically part of the physical landscape of the prophet's biography, which is something that both Muslim scholars, but also um, rulers like the caliph and governors in this period are interested in getting this history together. We know that both the Umayyads and the Abbasids are patronizing scholars. The famous one is Ibn Ishaq being patronized by the Abbasids, but plenty of other evidence of scholars having to do with the ruling houses and getting texts together, but also in that the scholars' stories about these places can be used in indicating that these really are places, and the rulers are also interested in building mosques in these places that are associated with the biography of the prophet. So I think that the stories are legitimizing in that way for the places as well. But yes, also of course for legitimizing practices associated with those places. So like stories about what the prophet did when he went inside the Kaaba, for example, whether one should pray inside the Kaaba or not. So this is obviously a point of debate, whether this is an important part of the practice of visiting the Kaaba, was actually going inside of it or not. But yes, I think the question of these scholars going to these places was a point of debate of whether this was like necessary practice or not. And I think most, it's seen as a point of piety for sure with someone like Ibn Umar and these. I think that it's an interesting question of like what with the story of Bukhari literally following the prophet's footsteps in the dream. Is this does this just mean sort of like, you know, literally following the footsteps, or is it sort of like more, you know, he's following the model of the prophet very closely? And I think this question of like what exactly, how closely to follow the prophet's model is something that's being worked out in this period. So there's an interesting set of stories about the Umayyads trying to make this particular pass into part of the Hajj practices, like going into this particular pass as part of the Hajj practices. Um, scholars are saying, well, this was a place where the prophet went and like relieved himself during the period during when he was on Hajj. It's not an important. This is not a like a mat. This is not part of the manasik. It's just something where the prophet was for a certain period of time. It's not like a holy space. It's not an important part of the practice of the Hajj. But the question of like how closely do we have to follow the prophet's example? Do we? Yeah. So I think this question of like how sacred spaces, how the prophets stories about the prophet, and how the individuals telling these stories interact is like a really interesting question that like epistemologically is quite fascinating for trying to work out this history and the way that it's subsequently used by different Muslim communities. Yeah.
No, thank you. I have a lot of follow up questions, but I guess one of the things that would stand out, I guess. Okay, so you sort of mentioned how there was this attempt to sort of formalize certain behaviors in certain spaces. And in the book, you also mention how there's this sort of tension between popular religion, I guess, and
Mm-hmm.
sort of the attempts to sort of formalize certain spaces and behaviors. Anxieties around touching things, of course. Um, but I guess I'll get back to that in a second. But because you mentioned the inside the Kaaba, being inside the Kaaba, I thought that was a really interesting discussion you had. Because if I remember, was it a Abbasid attempt to sort of mark out the direction that the Prophet prayed inside the Kaaba, and um, I was just it's because it's like sort of disorienting being inside the Kaaba in a way, right? Because it's like
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden you can just pray in any direction, or like it's sort of and
Mm-hmm.
that, I thought that was like a really striking attempt to like formalize something that was
Yeah.
difficult to formalize, right? And a lot of the times
Right.
these things are just quite like mundane behaviors, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe things that people might think are intuitive. So maybe if you, I guess, yeah, maybe if we can learn more about this tension between formalization and the politics of formalization,
Yeah.
and popular religion, or attempts to sort of um, respond to popular practices that are coming from the ground up in a way.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, this question of like popular religion is it a difficult one when all we have are literary sources for the most part, right? So um, this is something that characterizes the study of religion more broadly is calling practices having to do with the relics or the visitation of shrines or just holy places in general as popular religion, sort of marginalized as not the sort of little tradition versus the big tradition kind of thing. And so this is something that you see not only in the study of Islam, but in Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, in other traditions. That these kinds of practices having often, things having to do with the body are often marginalized as sort of popular practice versus like, the disembodied practice of texts and thought. Um, so yeah, this and as you brought up, Iyad, this question of touching is very much something that's part of this discussion. So, for example, like what to do with the Maqam Ibrahim, where it's in the Quran it's said to be a musalla. It's said to be a sign of God, and the question, and therefore that Quranic verse that says it's a musalla is often used as a sort of polemical device to say, like, yeah, it's a musalla, it's a place to pray. You're not supposed to touch it. So this appears in several hadith or reports from different interpreters and companion. Ibn Zubair in particular is associated with this saying that, you know, it's a place to pray. It's not, you're not supposed to actually touch it. And so there's a lot of sort of scholarly debate, well, not even debate, but just sort of like criticism of what you know, arguably indicates that there is some sort of popular practice associated with going and touching the Maqam Ibrahim as part of being in these sacred spaces in Mecca. At the same time, we've got, you know, these stories about people that it's hard not to say are very much non-popular people. They're the elite that are in fact literally touching the Maqam Ibrahim. People like the Caliph al-Mahdi, the Abbasid Caliph, and also, you know, in these stories, it's, you know, people that are called scholars also coming and doing the same. So I think that there's, you know, the question of this being sort of popular versus elite practice is a little probably incorrect, although it's easy to sort of think that from, you know, the elite scholarly sources that we have that are often trying to sort of marginalize this practice as well. This is what the NAS does, the non-scholarly people are doing. And yeah, the question of it's an interesting question. So Ayad brought up this effort to try to demarcate where exactly within the Kaaba that the Prophet had prayed, and there's these stories about the Umayyad Caliph Al-Walid ibn Abdul Malik installing this black stone as a sign of the where the Prophet would face when he was inside the Kaaba to perform prayer. And there's also some stories or reports within both historical sources, but also some Shi'i hadith about a particular colored marble on the floor being exactly where the Prophet would stand and prostrate within the Kaaba. And so, yeah, and the question of like, yes, there's this question of like, is this an effort to sort of like limit where people might be performing prayer, to try to demarcate. It's so Finbar Berry Flood has this very interesting article or book chapter from several years ago about these black stones that are associated with the prophet's places of prayer. So there's evidence there's reports of these black stones in the Kaaba in Mecca, in the Prophet's mosque, particularly in the mihrab in the Prophet's mosque in Medina, and then also a black stone in a mihrab that exists within the Dome of the Rock. And the textual evidence, and then also some physical evidence that he points to, or some material evidence, indicates that this was a project by the Umayyads and Al-Walid in particular to sort of like formalize this practice of praying in places associated with the Prophet's places of prayer. And he makes this case. He makes this important point. Flood does that. He asks this question of, is this almost certainly there were other places too? Is this a way of trying to make these places more important and other places less important, or, you know, to formalize this practice that like popular memory or popular practice might have had other places that were associated with the Prophet. And it's a good question of, you know, is this just giving an elite imprimatur to what was already popular practice? Is this using elite tools to try to, demarcate some things as acceptable practice when other things weren't? And I think these are very good questions that it's difficult to answer in a lot of ways. I mean, we do have I have an article coming out that it wasn't just the installation of these stones that was part of like demarcating spaces associated with where the Prophet prayed, but also the rubbing perfume on certain places. So there was the perfumed column within the Prophet's mosque that was used as a sign of where the Prophet had prayed. There was actually a spot on the outside of the Kaaba where a particular stone on the front of the Kaaba, on the face of the Kaaba, was said to it had like a little indentation that was used as a sign of where the Prophet had prayed. And also there's like the scholar Al-Faqihi says he saw haluk, or perfume, on that part of the kiswa, which was where the Prophet had prayed. So yeah, I think that and I ask in the article, can we say that these were this was another Umayyad way of demarcating spaces, or was this something separate from Umayyad practice? Was it actually in contradistinction to Umayyad practices? And I'm not sure the answer in a lot of ways. But yeah, I think this question of, I mean, it's also a question which is very relevant to the project that Harun and Iyad are pursuing, of like of knowledge, of whose knowledge counts as important, right? Is it the knowledge transmitted by scholars? Is it knowledge that's being patronized by rulers like the caliph and governors? And when these things interact or contradict our points of, sometimes we see them in the sources, sometimes we don't. And those are, interesting questions to ask, especially about this kind of material, I think. Yeah.
No, yeah. I mean, one of the in a way, it's difficult when you're working with text, as we all know. It's impossible to answer some things. But I think in terms of like what you're focusing on, it's very like topical even today. Like I recently attended a talk on Sufi shrines by Shabana Javier, and she was talking about how Sufi shrines in Sri Lanka sort of appear sometimes around particular natural places. And I thought some parts of your book also really touch on basically this similar phenomenon. So when you were talking about this idea of forgetting or not really knowing where something actually is, so the tree that people take bay'ah under, and a sort of popular practice emerges about people, and where people incorporate this tree into their pious practices. And then also, what I also really liked was one of these was the story of Daniel's grave being moved under the river, and in a way, sort of sacralizing sort of the entire city almost, and like the water that flows through the city.
Right.
And
Right.
so I mean, I think these questions that you're answering in your book, or that you're talking about in your exploring in your book, they have, I mean, there you can obviously see them reappearing in lots of different fields and in different fields of scholarship.
Right.
So I mean, that's one thing I wanted to ask you about as well, which was about the not knowing exactly where something is, or what
Mm.
something might be, and how that sort of opens the potential to sort of to for like more spot, like almost like a spontaneous shrine or something, like and like
Mm.
um there was this tension around the tree in
Mm.
particular, I guess there are
Yeah.
also discussions of like, not discussions, but there are texts like Ibn Wahshi that talk about trees and sacred trees that are sort of practices that exist in the pre-Islamic past, and probably sort of
Hmm.
continue for a while.
Right.
So yeah, I maybe
Right.
a little bit more about this. This sort of not knowing exactly where something is, and how important is it for for people to know exactly like what something is. So like
You know?
yeah, so in a way, like you also mentioned the issue around the sandal, and whether there's a story
Mhm.
about the caliph not really
Yeah.
knowing or not really believing that there's the sandal of the prophet, but it has a social significance,
Yeah.
social function, right? So yeah.
No, these are very good questions, and I can tell that you're on a project about knowledge transmission right now, because that's a very pertinent question. Um, yeah, so the story about the tree is that it's this tree associated with the performance of bay'ah by the Medinans, giving bay'ah to the prophet. Um, and yeah, there's different versions of the story. One of which is that when the Caliph Umar learned that people were going and praying beside this tree, he came and cut it down, because he said people shouldn't be creating a place of prayer associated with the prophet at this tree. But then there's also versions of the story that say that they 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 just didn't know where this place was. Basically, that like there were people. Well, and the story is told within the context of, again, people praying beside this tree, and then when someone asks, well, why are you doing this, they say, oh, it's the tree where the prophet accepted bay'ah. And they say, well, my someone says, I think it's Ibn Musayyib, the famous Medinan scholar. He says, well, my father was a part of the community that did bay'ah, or that took bay'ah with the prophet there, and they immediately forgot where the tree was. So how do you know where it is? Um, and so, yeah, I think it's an interesting question, the question of not knowing. And I think that there is like this real emphasis that's placed on the sources, on the importance of knowing that basically like a version of the importance of isnad, of knowledge being transmitted through the generations, about, in this case, like the correct geography of where this event took place. That if you're going to, I mean, it seems like an implicit indication that the knowing where the actual place is important. That not knowing is bad. That if you know the actual place, then maybe there's um, some virtue in visiting this place, or at least some virtue in knowing that it's the place. But if you don't know, then it's meaningless. Um, or at the very least, it renders the practice of praying there as meaningless in some way, or less meaningful. Yeah, that's something to tease out exactly, but that's an interesting point. Um, and yeah, and then this question of the story of someone bringing a sandal that this individual claims is a sandal of the prophet, and he brings it to the Abbasid Caliph al Mahdi, and and the caliph kisses it and presses it to his eyes, and then when the man who gave it to him leaves, he says, I know that this probably wasn't a actual sandal ever touched by the prophet, but I did this so that that man would not speak ill of me to people. And basically, this is often cited as a story about the sort of like wiliness of the caliph, the sort of or his wisdom, um, his political wisdom in sort of. It's often cited as a story of like elite versus popular belief, that he knows that this is not a real relic, but he's gonna play dumb for this uneducated individual. Um, and it's an interesting story. It also indicates like, there's the question of like, well, in terms of the barakah associated with the sandal, does it matter that if it's real, or if it really ever touched the prophet? and the implication seems to be that it would matter, that he's not a fool in thinking that this ever touched the prophet's body. And again, like these, it's interesting that these stories um, argue. I think that these objects probably often were transmitted alongside stories of how they came to be in the ownership of whatever individual had them at any given time, right? So a sort of form, again, a form of like isnad, or at least a sort of how these, because in any given object is not wholly without a story being associated with it, right? So like there's in the example of like late antique Christianity, there's these examples of relics that have like little tags associated with them, indicate, this little stone that has a tag that says this came from the Holy Land at this site, or this came from the shrine of this saint. Da, 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 da. An object that if you just put it on the ground, it just looks like a rock. But because it's labeled in this way, that's what makes it holy. So I think that the knowledge associated with where an object came from or what the history of this object or place is, I think that ends up being crucially important in a lot of ways. And the question of, and yes, what's provoked as dangerous in these sources is the question of not knowing, of memory being forgotten, and how that provokes, anxiety, or at the least like discomfort with, if you don't know the actual authenticity, then that's a problem. Um, I mean, you see it even now in Saudi Arabia with the site of the prophets, that's usually understood as to be the site of the prophet's birth, which was transformed into a library in the mid 20th century. And there's there's signs around. And one of the ways that veneration of the site is discouraged is, it says on the sign that like there's no like hard evidence that this was ever the birthplace of the prophet. So again, this question of knowledge, of like, and the lack of knowledge, of not knowing for certain that something is what it purports to be, is part of the anxiety associated with practices of veneration associated with such a site, I think. So I think the question of like not knowing is a really good one. And the importance of knowing, and how not knowing creates anxiety for whether any of these practices are legitimate or not.
Yeah. If I may, I have a quick question. If you can stick with the sandals for a moment. What I found really interesting, one of your passages when you were reflecting on the sandals, was how these very sandals were. This is like a coming together of relics and textual learning, where you talk about. I think it was in Darul Hadith Ashrafiyah in Damascus, and where it was
Mm,
placed there. And I found that very, very interesting that you see kind of this coming together of a relic, but also this sort of what's usually seen as a textual transmission of knowledge and coming
right,
together, and one kind of blessing the other, if you like.
right,
And that was a really neat way of kind of thinking about, I think, how that works together in some ways. And they're not seen as sort of separate or distinct ways of transmitting things.
right. Because it's a school of hadith transmission, and but it's also one of the reasons that it's sort of venerated as a site is its possession of this sandal of the prophet. Yeah, it's a place where people would come and visit, and even make pilgrimage to, I guess. Um, so that's an interesting point. That it's an intersection of the relic and the text. Yeah.
I I had another question on a sort of knowledge and transmission of hadith. Even though I know your book is about a lot more, but I mean, there's only so much
Mhm.
to cover. But just to stay with it.
Yeah. No, sure.
Um, so on page 172, you talk about Ibn Umar again, and it's someone mentions that he's a good transmitter of hadith because he's able to um,
Hmm.
the Prophet without tears forming in his eyes, and would only discuss Hadith when sitting up
Hmm.
in order to give the topic its proper respect. I thought that was interesting in a way, because it seemed to say that sort of getting too emotional would somehow worsen the Hadith transmission in a way, or like compromise the sort of one's ability to transmit Hadith, and also the idea of a sort of a specific bodily habitus when transmitting Hadith or when teaching. That was an interesting little detail, I thought.
Yeah,
Is that a common thing that you come across in the sources?
I think the idea of a bodily habitus is, yeah, something that I'm I'm interested in looking into more, and I think that there is evidence of that. Yeah, that there's a particular um, way of holding the body as being, yeah, part of the prophet, or I'm sorry, well, I was going to say part of prophetic practice, but I'm part of giving proper due to the transmission of knowledge about the prophet. But I actually read the tears in his eyes part as different than you did. I think it's indicating, not that it indicates that, yeah, not throwing into question the accuracy or the reliability of his transmission, but more just like his piety, that, like, and this idea of like piety as causing you to weep is something that we find like often in like Zud sources and things like that. And I think that's kind of like what's going on here, right? That he's talking about the prophet makes him weep with, yeah, I don't know what emotion or affect you might call it, but thinking about, I guess, maybe devotion to the prophet, or just his deep piety and thinking about the prophet. Yeah,
Right.
that's the way I read it.
Oh, sorry. I think I misread it. I think I missed the negative was never able to. Oh, so, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Now I understand it a bit better, right? But that's interesting as well, I guess.
Oh,
So
okay.
the emotion was part of as more of a legitimizing uh, factor, right? That's yeah,
Yeah, I think, yeah, which is interesting in and of itself, right? Yeah.
yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and I mean, I think that, as far as like actual example, I think, it's also said, I've never seen a man more scrupulous of awra than Ibn Amr. And I think this idea of being, fastidious in one's like cleanliness and these kinds of things are certainly things that we see in discussions of hadith transmitters. Um, but yeah, and also a lot of stuff about like wara, having to do with like, uh, not, this is often something that appears in like Zud source, so like asceticism, um, but because there's an overlap between that and Hadith transmission in this period, this question of like, the proper control of your senses, not smelling a lot of perfume, not, and therefore not putting on a lot of perfume, not like casting your eyes at things that you shouldn't see, um, not touching fine materials, this kind of thing. Um, which I'm sure also, there's a certain tension there, because the transmission of hadith was also associated with certain merchant circles in this period. So it would be interesting to see how these kinds of the bodily habitus is dealt with in terms of these kinds of questions. Something as I said, something I'm interested in looking at more.
I guess one thing that I didn't we didn't talk a lot about the prophet's body. If you want to maybe um, talk a little bit about how um, the diffusion of the prophet's body parts, and there was this your first chapters discussed the corruption of the body. Sort of wanted to cover that because it's a big part of the book. So yeah, like I guess relating to bodily habitus is a good time to go into it, and that would be my
Yeah,
penultimate or ultimate question. Yeah.
sure. Yeah. So I mean, yeah, there emerges around these stories emerge around the death of the prophet, and directly conflicting stories about either he, one of the ways they knew he was dead was that his body had started to decompose, or that he didn't decompose at all, and that this is a character, and this also appears as a hadith in certain collections that the prophet says that the bodies of prophets don't decompose, and this is extended to the category of wasis in Shi'i hadith. So yeah, this question of the prophet's body and its integrity becomes quite significant, apparently, from quite early, and that this even when in hadith where the prophet says, like, I'm with you now, and I'll be with you after I die because I'll pray for you. And a listener says, well, how will you pray for us when you've decomposed in the grave? And that's when he says, well, prophets' bodies don't decay. And I connect this question of the importance of the integrity of the prophet's body to the question of the prophet's intercession for believers after his death. So while the prophet's intercession is often connected to the day of judgment, there's also these sources that indicate that in the time period between now and then, that the prophet is sort of like continually intercessing and giving his intercession for the community, or at least like giving his blessing to the community. But this question of the prophet's body's integrity, it just seems to have been something that was pondered by Muslim scholars in this period. I think there's connections to the ways that saints' bodies in Christian communities were understood as similarly not decomposing, as a sign of their holiness. And this also is something that we see in Muslim discussions of not just the Prophet Muhammad, but other prophets like the Prophet Daniel and the Prophet, he's called John the Baptist in Christian tradition, but Yahya in Islamic tradition, that his head is discovered also not decomposed. And so it becomes this sign of holiness, but in regards to the Prophet Muhammad's non-decomposed body, it particularly seems to have more meaning than just indicating his holiness, but also the ways that he's going to not provide, but fulfill a certain theological function for the community after his death as well. Which is interesting in a lot of ways, I think, because you could argue, well, he could just, God could just sort of put him back together after he's decomposed, but there seems to be some importance seen in the idea that he doesn't decompose at all, that his body remains intact from life onwards. And
you get that discussion developing, I guess, in later sort of Sufi and Shi'i circles as well.
What in those cases, what does the significance seem to be, do you think?
Well, there are traditions that the bodies of the awliya or the imams don't decompose. It becomes quite a
Right.
common. But it's interesting that it's happening so early. Actually, this discussion. There are lots of things that and that you mentioned in the book that I can see in later medieval, like it sort of puts things into perspective for me in the later medieval period. So, a lot of things that are extended to the prophet's body in terms of like seeing it in a dream, or it not decomposing, or the sort of diffusion of the sort of body parts, the relics, that has parallels with Sufis, Sufi shuyukh, Sufi saints, if saints, awliya.
Right.
It's a super interesting and useful discussion that you presented.
I
Yeah,
think,
yeah,
that was one of the points that I wanted to make in the book, was that these things that we often think of as emerging in like the medieval period or the early modern period are things that we see from quite early within the tradition, actually.
That's super interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I think that we really it was a really great discussion, Adam. And so, as I said, it's a really well written, interesting book that touches on so many parts of Islamic studies, so many fields of Islamic studies. We could talk about it for a really long time.
Thank you for having me here for the discussion.
Of course, no, it's our pleasure. And yeah, no, I think that's all we have time for, really. Harun, if you wanna. Um,
Yeah, I just want to say, like, this book is a really fantastic book. I've really enjoyed reading it, and I love your rich references, your footnotes. Primary sources, all primary sources. I found them very, very useful to go back to, or just to highlight them for future reading. So I want to thank you personally for that. And I just want to thank Iyad for being here, Adam for being here. It's wonderful. It's a lovely summer evening here in the UK. So nice to have this conversation. And that I hope that our viewers can join us for more on the Legacies of Learning Project podcast, where we hope and we challenge and we explore the Islamic intellectual tradition to explore how that rich legacy can help us today. So until next time, thank you very much, everyone. Bye bye.